This is, as I mentioned earlier, the fourth in the series of the interfaith discussions. Professor Falvey has given a little bit of information about himself on the back of the Order of Service paper. He gave that to me, and I thought that was rather modest for a person who has achieved so many things in his lifetime, in his career. He once lived in Melbourne, once lived in Darwin before the Darwin cyclone. He then went and lived some 15 years, was it, or some long period of time in Malaysia. And he has been very much involved in the field of agriculture. In 1995, he was the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture, Forestry and Horticulture to integrate 6 agricultural, horticultural and food colleges with existing university departments of agriculture and forestry to create what is certainly Australia's largest and probably most forward-looking faculty of agriculture and related activities. In addition to his own distinguished professional career, in terms of what he achieved in his own university studies, he has led many international missions in more than 100 international teams and been responsible for his organisation's projects in more than 60 countries. He is the author of more than 80 scientific and development papers and 4 books, one of which is here today, or it will be in the hall, in the upstairs hall today, a Buddhist interpretation of Jesus' words, and he's left some copies there for anyone who'd like to read that book. Its dedication is rather touching, I thought. He dedicated it to his mother, who is here in church today. Can I see her somewhere? Over there, yes. And it says, to his mother, who, by ensuring a Sunday school education, by indulging a teenage obsession with the church, and by providing a book on comparative religions at a critical time, stimulated my sporadic yet lifelong search for life's essence. A great dedication. And of course, part of his search has been within the whole the Buddhist field, the Buddhist faith. And we're going to hear him speak about that today. After he has spoken, he will come back down to our level, and I will then engage him for a short time in a conversation. So bear with us as we proceed through those 2 processes today. But now he's asked us to sing this hymn, which he feels well reflects something of the quietness of the Buddhist philosophy. And it's a hymn that you'll all know, if not from recent singing, then from old-time religious faith. It's Lead Kindly Light, hymn number 494 in your hymn books.
Dr. Macnab, thank you very much for allowing that hymn to be sung. I find it could be a hymn from any particular tradition. In Buddhist terms, I think it expresses what we call the bodhicitta, that spirit within each of our own hearts and minds that leads us in a spiritual path. I'm aware that it's a special hymn in this church. I think it's a treat to have it sung one more time. I'm aware that there are many members of this congregation who follow meditative and Buddhist practices of their own, and I think it's worth stating on a day like this that this church represents an openness uncommon in the Christian church, and one which I think is leading many people towards what is essential in their own spiritual development. I particularly note Marion Robertson and Barry Fox here today, and I thank them for their contributions to my life, but also to the spirit of this community. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Dharmachara Siladasa, Chairman of the Melbourne Buddhist Centre, here with us today. I believe there are also a few practising Buddhists sprinkled amongst the congregation, but they don't really stand out because they don't fall into the colourful stereotypes of Buddhists. So if it's not saffron robes and fragrant incense and stunning architecture, what is Buddhism? Well, Buddhism is just a Western word. It's a modern Western word to describe something that we've hardly discovered. It's less than a century that we came to know very much about Buddhism, and at this stage we still don't understand it properly from our own cultural perspective. What I can say today is just the tip of a large iceberg, but Buddhism, like any other tradition, offers many ways to understand it. I hope what I say is one of those ways. To itself, Buddhism has long been known for millennia simply as the Dharma. The word Dharma is also something confusing to us. It's translated as the truth, reality, the natural order, duty, work, and so on. So it's hard for our Western mental processes to accommodate such apparently inconsistent definitions. But in fact, they all do unite under something that we might just refer to as fitting into the way that life is, fitting in with reality. Buddhism is also offering a way of doing that, and thus rising to a higher plane of equanimity and contentment. So we might say that we could appreciate Buddhism, if not understand it, by simply assisting us to fit in with the natural laws of the universe, and also as a profound insight into the workings of the human mind. From these two things, Buddhism derives spiritual practices that lead us to know the nature of reality and to live within that reality. This essential message of Buddhism pervades all of its forms, and it comes in various forms. It's worth just considering some of these forms and the reason for the variation briefly. We have the Theravadan tradition with its practices and rules, the Mahayana tradition with its metaphysics, the Vajrayana with its rituals, and then there are the colourful Tibetans who combine all of these with some additional cultural elements. But these are not differences in the same sense that denominations may be different in the Christian church, for example. They do represent progressive reformations when the essence of Buddhism at times got stuck, as happens in all human institutions, be they Buddhist, Christian or other. But today we can best understand them as simply different approaches with cultural attachments that people use that suit them by their backgrounds or their disposition to understand more of what Buddhism is really saying. Each of these traditions is borrowed from the others, even though they were historical corrections and they were developed in different cultures and they acquired elements of those cultures, the essence is the same. Some of these changes appear significant to us, such as one of the idealisations of the concept of compassion put into pictorial or iconographic form, an image that was once male as it transferred through different countries at different times became female, rather like Jesus being portrayed in feminine form. This might seem strange to us, but it doesn't to the Buddhists who engage in it. They just understand that it is a means of thinking about compassion as a teaching device. Not only do these historic names and different types of Buddhism continue today, their differences are made greater by the way that we, with our Western way of seeing things and categorising into boxes, seem to be made more separate than they actually are. It's important for us to simply notice that even persons following these different yanas or different forms of Buddhism have across history shared monasteries, shared teachers and shared friendships. Expressed in this way, Buddhism might not sound the same as Christianity, but what I'm saying today is part of a series about common ground between religious traditions, and I believe it is really saying the same thing. For example, such key concepts of Christianity as salvation and redemption may well be descriptions of the same thing as insight and enlightenment in Buddhism. And in addition, the methods used for spiritual practice or spiritual development are essentially similar: calming the mind through meditation or prayer and ethical behaviour. Why do they appear different then? Well, the three reasons that seem to create most of the differences are the cultural accumulations that every tradition acquires where it is developed or where it is enhanced, institutional biases Wherever we create a large human institution, we end up with competing objectives that may not be strictly what was originally intended, and errors of literality. These don't just occur with fundamentalists in Christian or other Semitic traditions, they can occur in Buddhism also. So stripped of these major obstacles, past which we often don't see, we find the Buddha's words on the subject, or what are said to be the Buddha's words. He said, "Whatever teaching conduces to the elimination of personal suffering, that is the Dharma, that is Buddhism." So having mentioned suffering, perhaps it's the right time to introduce Buddhism in a more conventional manner. The usual way this is done is by talking of the Four Noble Truths. Buddhism is rife with numbers. Everything is 4 this, 8 that, 3 this, 3 that. And the reason is it's a tradition that developed in its first 400 to 500 years without written texts, and it was passed on by an oral tradition, and these were ways of remembering things more easily. The Four Noble Truths: 1, suffering exists in everyday life. 2, suffering arises from our craving for or being attached to something. 3, with that knowledge, a cure for suffering exists. And 4, the cure is to follow the spiritual practices laid out in practical detail and from experience, which can vary according to our individual psychological makeup. This 1, 2, 3, 4 approach is in fact nothing special to Buddhism. It just represents the traditions of 2,500 years ago in India in medical terms of saying, here is the problem, is there a cure, this is the cure, and follow this course to implement the cure. So this is simply a summary of the positive application of a natural law. I said earlier that Buddhism is teaching us to understand reality or natural law or whatever words we use for that. It is a summary of the major insight, or what many people consider the major insight of Buddhism, which is known as conditionality, amongst many other names. Conditionality is simply saying that every phenomena, everything, is a product of conditions, or in the words of the Buddha, so it is said, from this, that arises. In the absence of this, this does not arise. It sounds simple, but in fact it's a deep and complex insight. It explains all conceivable physical and mental phenomena, and whatever other phenomena there might be that aren't physical or mental. For example, it explains the arising of suffering from craving and attachment. If we are not attached, we do not suffer. Of course, this can sound callous in our culture, but it's not meant to be. It's based on and conducted in an atmosphere for the development of compassion and loving kindness for oneself, for all other beings, and indeed all other things. Conditionality also explains why Buddhism encourages personal spiritual practice in the form of meditation to calm the mind, and in ethics. In the case of meditation, it's simply creating positive conditions for the cultivation of wisdom. If you like, it's the wise use of the insight of conditionality. Conditionality does the same thing with ethics. If we act in a non-violent manner, for example, we are creating conditions within ourselves which encourage us to act that way more in the future, becoming habitual, if you like, and also having an effect on everything around us, creating other positive conditions. From the practices of meditation and ethical action, we move towards greater insight, or if you like, enlightenment. Now, enlightenment may simply be an ideal, like most things in spiritual traditions. So if we talk about who's enlightened and who's not, we may get ourselves in a difficult mire. The fruits of enlightenment, similar words to the fruits of the Spirit used in the Christian tradition, are wisdom expressed through compassion and loving kindness. These are the hallmarks of Buddhism, however it is practiced. To me, all this is the same as the essential message of Jesus, when the three elements of cultural accretions, institutional biases and literality are removed. Such matters in Buddhism as what is God, is there a God, and other questions that might not normally be raised in this sort of forum, they don't concern Buddhism at all. The absence of a God in Buddhism is sometimes used to suggest that Buddhism is somehow an aberration amongst the world's great religions. Again, the difference disappears if we examine the essence of the spiritual messages. Perhaps the best way to touch on what is possibly a sensitive subject is for me to use the words of Buddhadasa, a Thai forest monk who, when asked to deliver the prestigious Sinclair Thompson Memorial Lectures at a Protestant seminary, chose to try to communicate a message about Buddhism in the Christian language, using the metaphors and the words of Christianity. He researched this thoroughly and from his own personal insights concluded that all that is usually attributed to God consists within the Buddhist insight of conditionality. He was simply seeking a common ground for further discussion to help Christians and Buddhists understand that they were saying the same thing and to get rid of all the nonsense of comparative religion that points out differences. This is the essential common ground between the two traditions of Christianity and Buddhism. But there are also many other similarities, and we possibly should note some of those, particularly in terms of the teachings that are in the scriptures and the lives of the founders of the respective religions. In terms of common teachings, these have been isolated by countless scholars. They include such things as teachings about loving one's enemies, repaying evil with kindness, practicing compassionate equanimity, self-examination rather than criticism of others, living simply rather than materialistically, intention as the source of sin or unskillful action, not the action itself, the advantages of the unattached or homeless life, disinterest of mundane worries, and the oneness of all things, and countless other similar teachings. And commonalities between the Buddha and Jesus themselves in their own lifestyles, for what we know about them, include extending the spiritual life to marginalised people, not just sticking with the privileged upper-class people, choosing disciples who, from their own practice, would inform others and extend the message of the Dharma or the truth or the gospel more widely. We also see it in the myths that surround these persons, such as overcoming 3 temptations, being born of virgins, and so on. They both started reformist movements. They both underwent their spiritually transformative processes at about the age of 30. They both based their teachings on those transformative experiences. They both offended the establishment. They both lived as itinerants. This common ground might well be summarised in the Buddha's words, "He who sees the Dharma sees me," which is echoed in Jesus' later words, "He who sees me sees the Father." Buddhism uses various formulations to convey these central messages. One of them is structural and bears another striking resemblance to the Christian church. For example, Buddhists talk of the 3 jewels, back into numbers again, the 3 jewels. The 3 jewels are the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. The first, the Buddha, simply means an historic person who proved the approach through his own experience, developed insights that we might be able to follow through his example and gain confidence from that, a role in which many persons would also see Jesus. The second, the Dharma, in this context simply means the teachings or the scriptures, obviously the Bible. And the third, the Sangha, or the congregation, the fellowship, simply refers to choosing to mix with fellow practitioners for mutual support. And that's another example of conditionality. By putting ourselves in the condition of mixing with persons of similar aspirations, it's conducive to our further development. Perhaps the common ground between Buddhism and Christianity relates at this stage of the collective understanding of Buddhists and Christians of each other to two general areas, perhaps to the explanation of suffering, which is such a difficult subject within our own culture, for what they really are. So I'd like to just conclude with other people's words in two cases. The first, a joke from Father Anthony de Mello. These are insightful jokes presented by this, he's now died. Father de Mello was a Jesuit priest in India for most of his life. The more time he spent in India, the more he appreciated the Indian culture and the deep spiritual traditions of that culture. And the more he appreciated that, the less the Vatican seemed to appreciate what he wrote. His books were for sale in the Catholic bookshop in Lonsdale Street with an insert from the Vatican explaining that these books shouldn't really be sold in Catholic bookshops. One of his stories relates to a spiritual master and a preacher. So the spiritual master of an unspecified tradition asked the preacher, who is clearly of a tradition we're familiar with here, "Why do you emphasise the value of suffering in your sermons?" To which the preacher replied, "Because it seasons us to face whatever life may bring." The master said nothing. Later, a disciple of the master came and asked him, "Exactly what does suffering season us to face?" And the master replied, "Presumably more suffering." This is not the message of Buddhism. I don't think it's the message of Jesus either. But there is much common ground that we walk over without noticing. But the final word should go to a person steeped in our culture who understood us in his time, the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, who said, "The Buddha gave his doctrine to enlighten the world. Christ gave his life. It is for Christians to discern the doctrine. Perhaps in the end, the most valuable part of the doctrine of the Buddha is its interpretation of Jesus' life." Thank you.
Well, why then be a Buddhist? If we've got so many similarities, why did you, as it were, throw over the Christian tradition, faith, and become a Buddhist?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes. Have I thrown over the Christian faith? Am I a Buddhist? I don't really like labels, so I see myself as somebody following some spiritual path through my own way, and I think through my own exposure to Buddhism in Asia, it has complemented what I studied in the church and learnt from my church experiences. In terms of the other part of the question, no, I certainly wouldn't recommend someone throwing over their own faith to follow another.
What good then is Buddhism to us in a practical world where most people, no, I shouldn't say most people, but there'll be many people who'd say, well, that's all right to do your meditation, but we're living in a pretty harsh world. It's all very well for the Dalai Lama to say we need to have a demilitarized world, but is that reality? Is the Buddhist really living in a real world?
The teachings of Buddhism would say that only a highly skilled practitioner of Buddhism is living in the real world. And that person might be somebody from another faith tradition because, as I said earlier, Buddhism is really our word applied to a general understanding of the real nature of reality. In terms of living in a complex world, as we all do, I think the time of the Buddha was probably a complex world, the time of Jesus was probably a complex world, and they were both addressing how do we relate to what is the highest form, the highest potential of human beings, and from that, what do we actually understand in ourselves? If we can reach that higher spiritual plane, then we may see things more clearly. If we see them more clearly, presumably we don't engage in some of the activities that you're inferring. in realistic terms, this hasn't ever happened for a large part of the population, so perhaps we should be content with treating these as they were perhaps originally intended, as personal development paths rather than social development paths.
Yes, the Christian church itself hasn't a very good track record anyway in many of these concerns. And if I move over to one matter, the treatment of women, the issue of sexuality, we've got a very shabby record in both of those areas. What about Buddhism? Do they have a better track record as far as sexuality and the role of women in society are concerned?
The short answer should be no.
They're no better.
But I would like to add to that. As Buddhism is practiced predominantly in Asian countries, it's the culture of those countries which pervades rather than being an aspect of Buddhism. The teachings of Buddhism appear to say that there is no distinction between gender. The historical record suggests that men have been ordained and had the facility for ordination much more than women in the monastic tradition. This would appear to be a cultural interpretation rather than a specific teaching of Buddhism.
Mm-hmm. And the matter of suffering that you spoke about is a matter that concerns us greatly. Some of the practitioners of Buddhism here frequently tell me how to cope with pain and suffering, and I reply to them, yes, it's all very well if you haven't got pain and if you're not suffering. But when you are in pain, has the Buddhist practice got something special to tell us?
Yes and no. The first thing is, if we're in physical pain, and I know you're referring to physical pain, there's physical pain, that's that. And it's an acknowledgement that there is physical pain and that is the reality at that time. The suffering that also is associated with that is the mental suffering of saying, I don't like that physical pain and I would like to be in a different situation, and creating an anxiety associated with that. Buddhism does address that.
It gives us a different mindfulness to meet the suffering or the pain.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's part of it. It's saying that under these conditions, pain could not but exist. It is just the reality, and it's pointless to think about it in any other way.
Way back in the traditional or conventional Christianity, and I don't subscribe to it, I add, that it was often said, well, if you're in pain, you should pray more and your pain would go. Is that any different from your view in Buddhism, which said, if you get your mind right, what's the difference of that?
I don't know, praying more would probably give you sore knees and take your mind off the other pain.
Well said. A distraction is better than concentration, yes, good. Then let me say one thing more about the Buddhist. The Buddhist has something to say about renouncing the self and the Christianity, in some interpretation, said that you must deny the self and forget that you've got a self. I think that's impossible, but what about this renunciation of the self and being apart from what is in fact the self connected with other things? Could you comment on that?
Yes, I think it's an important thing that's often misunderstood, and these are very complex things, and I don't pretend to understand them fully. I think it's rather like jumping into Christianity with no prior knowledge and understanding the depth of what the Trinitarian concept is trying to say.
I hope we can give that away too, for that matter. Go ahead.
The teaching of non-self is accompanied with two other teachings of the nature of reality, just another version of describing the nature of reality, of impermanence and voidness. These are all complex. The teaching of non-self is often misidentified within Western society, I think particularly by people who are not particularly respectful of themselves, and they jump onto and attach to that unproductively. The teaching itself is not saying there is no such thing as a self. It's saying that we misunderstand what the self is, and in thinking it is a discrete entity with a continuity unattached to anything else. The teaching, as those two beautiful pieces of music told us, that we are part of a larger physical environment, we are like a kernel within a kernel, and so forth, is part of being connected. And the embracing teaching of interconnectivity is also a description of how the self exists only in association with all other living and non-living things. However, to interpret it, in my opinion, simply to say that there is no self and that Lindsay Falvey isn't here, that's pretty silly.
Yes, I didn't think you were really saying that. It was really a matter of distinguishing between too much self-centeredness, perhaps, or too much ego predominance.
Yes.
And seeing that the self needs to be integrated within one's relationships and one's world. Is that the sort of thing we're looking at?
Exactly, yes.
Yes. In which case the self as such is something that needs to be developed rather than denied.
That form of self,
Yes.
of understanding integration with all other things, needs to be understood better, yes.
Yes. Now, I have a friend who owns 2 Ferraris and is very wealthy and plays the stock exchange, if one can say play it, that's not the right word. He manages himself very well on the stock exchange because he retains his ability to drive his 2 Ferraris. Can he be a good Buddhist at the same time?
In my opinion, why not?
Why not?
Yes.
So you can be wealthy and have the goods of this world and still be a thoroughgoing Buddhist?
Yes.
Yes.
If I could add to that slightly, I mentioned intentionality briefly as a teaching that I find in the Gospels as well as in Buddhist scriptures. If our intentions in our activities are appropriate, then the action itself will be. One can play the stock exchange in various ways, I'm sure.
Yes. So I'll reassure him when I see him tomorrow.
Yes. Send him around. Yes.
And I think probably my last matter is this matter of meditation, because as you know, we've got our meditation groups here, and we have when I wear my other hat, we have the issue of mindfulness groups to help people develop themselves in terms of coping with life and well-being. We were great friends with Ainsley Mears up the street when he practiced there, and he spoke on a number of occasions here, and so on. So what good, though, do you see is meditation for us all? So we're not needing to be Buddhists as such, but to be human beings. Has the Buddhist tradition, in its concentration on meditation, does it bring something very important to all of us? And if so, what is that?
I think it does bring something important to all of us. Of course, we all have different approaches to meditation, and our minds are probably all different in some small way. The meditation, as Buddhism sees it, is first objective is similar to what you have described as calming the mind. With a calm mind, then one can focus on what is occurring inside one's own mind and understand it more completely. With that knowledge, that becomes a form of wisdom to understand how one is acting and how everything else is occurring in the world. That is the deep and lasting benefit of Buddhism. But that takes a lifetime of practice.
But we could all begin. I think it's very important that we see that it is an important step each day to recenter our lives. In fact, you hear me say on Sunday mornings, we're here to recenter ourselves, and that recentering does give us a different attitude or a different approach to the various anxieties and worries which are part of the everyday realities. And in addition to which, I think we're seeing more medical practitioners, the surgeons and so on, are acknowledging more the value of meditation in terms of the healing processes. Have you noticed that also?
Yes, and I particularly heard that. I don't mix in all of those circles, but I do hear that from people who do.
Yeah. Well, that's very, very good and very, shall I use the word enlightening to us today? And I thank you, and I'm sure we all would like to thank you. Would you? Thank you.